The sun beat down on Jedediah Jed Stone's ranch, a relentless hammer on the anvil of the Texas plains, forging every moment into a test of endurance. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything. The weather-beaten planks of his cabin, the skeletal remains of his fences, even the sparse, wiry hairs of his own beard. The very air shimmered with heat, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sagebrush. It was 1870, and every day was a fight against the unforgiving elements, against the gnawing loneliness that was a constant companion, and against the ghosts that haunted his past, whispering regrets and old sorrows. His ranch wasn't just land, it was a fortress of solitude, built brick by painful brick after the war had taken everything else. His family, his hope, his sense of belonging. He preferred the silent company of his horses and the rhythmic creak of his well pump to the unpredictable, often treacherous nature of other men. He was out mending a section of fence, gnawing on a piece of jerky that tasted like leather and grit, when he saw him. A dark shape crumpled against a twisted mesquite, barely discernible from the shadows cast by the afternoon sun. Jed froze, his body tensing, hand instinctively reaching for the worn pistol on his hip, its familiar weight a cold comfort. Indians. Apaches. His stomach tightened into a knot of cold dread. The stories, the brutal raids, the pervasive fear ingrained in every settler's bone. It all flared, a primal alarm bell ringing in his mind. But as he cautiously approached, rifle held ready, he saw it wasn't a threat. It was a boy, no, a young man, certainly no older than 20, in Apache garb, bleeding heavily from a wound in his side. His eyes were glazed with pain, distant and unfocused, his breathing shallow and ragged, each breath a desperate struggle. He looked as broken and defeated as Jed felt most days, a mirror of shared human fragility. A fierce conflict raged within Jed. Every instinct screamed to ride away, to leave the savage to his fate in the merciless sun. This wasn't his fight. He'd seen too many fights, too much blood, enough to curdle a man's soul. Yet something in the young warrior's helpless gaze, perhaps a flicker of the same raw desperation Jed had known during his own darkest hours, stayed his hand. He remembered the fevered nights after a bullet had grazed his own side during the war, the desperate thirst that clawed at his throat, the aching cold that permeated his bones even under the summer sun. He knew this kind of suffering intimately. It was a fleeting, irrational moment of shared humanity, a crack in the hardened shell he had built around himself in a world that so vehemently valued division and prejudice. With a grunt that masked his internal struggle, Jed dismounted, his movements stiff from long hours in the saddle. He knelt, assessing the wound. It was deep, likely from a rifle shot, and already festering, a dark, angry stain spreading across the leather tunic. The young Apache stirred, a low moan escaping his lips, a sound of pure agony. Jed hesitated for another heart-pounding moment, the wind whispering forgotten warnings through the dry grass, carrying the dust of centuries of conflict. He knew the immense risk he was taking. Helping an Apache, even a wounded one, could be seen as an act of treason by his own kind, grounds for banishment or worse. Or more terrifyingly, it could be an invitation for trouble from the tribe itself, a perception of weakness or interference. But leaving him there, abandoning a fellow human to such a brutal end, felt profoundly wrong. It was a silent, burdensome acknowledgement of his own lingering humanity, a weight he thought he'd finally shed. He made a decision then, swift and unyielding, a silent vow to himself that he'd deal with the consequences later, whatever they might be. With a surprising surge of strength, born of a quiet desperation, he hoisted the unconscious warrior onto his horse, securing him as best he could against his own saddle. The ride back to the ranch was slow, each jolt a painful reminder of the fragile life he now carried, a life he had unexpectedly chosen to save. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, a fitting backdrop for the uneasy truce he had just struck with his own conscience. Inside the dimly lit barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay, dry dust, and something else, the metallic, coppery tang of fresh blood. Jed laid the young Apache, still unconscious, on a pile of clean straw he'd carefully arranged. He worked quickly, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man of his rough, calloused exterior. He heated water over a small, crackling fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. With practiced efficiency, he tore strips from an old clean shirt, fashioning crude but effective bandages. As he carefully cleaned the wound, wincing at the sight of the raw flesh, he noticed the intricate beadwork on the Apache's leather tunic, the fine, proud craftsmanship that spoke of a rich culture. Even in unconsciousness, the young man's features were stoic, a silent testament to endurance. This wasn't just a savage, a faceless enemy from the whispers of settlers. This was someone's son, someone's brother, a living, breathing human being. Hours passed in the hushed quiet of the barn. Jed sat on an overturned bucket, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the Apache's shallow, labored breathing. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, making you question every decision, every lonely choice you'd ever made. He thought about his own family, long gone, swept away by a war that had left him adrift and isolated, victims of a conflict far less personal, yet equally devastating than this one could become. A flicker of recognition, a shadow of pain, passed over the young Apache's face. He mumbled something in his native tongue, a sound like dry leaves skittering across the ground, a low, guttural lament. Jed couldn't understand the words, but the vulnerability in the sound, the raw human suffering it conveyed, was universal, needing no translation. When the warrior finally opened his eyes, they were dark, piercing, and wary, instantly assessing his surroundings and the man kneeling beside him. He tried to push himself up, but a gasp of searing pain stopped him, a sharp breath catching in his throat. Jed, without a word, anticipating the need, offered him a tin cup of water he'd fetched from the well. The Apache hesitated, his gaze locked on Jed's, searching for deceit, for malice, for any sign of ill intent. Jed held the cup steady, his face unreadable, offering no false assurances, only the simple act of sustenance. After a long moment, a tense eternity, the young man slowly reached out, his fingers brushing Jed's as he took the cup. The contact was brief, almost imperceptible, but it held the immense weight of centuries of mistrust, of conflict, now momentarily bridged by a shared, desperate need. He drank deeply, the water tracing a path of life down his parched throat, a visible relief washing over his face. Jed then offered him a small piece of dried venison, tough but nourishing, cut from his own meager supplies. The Apache ate it slowly, chewing deliberately, his eyes still on Jed, assessing, evaluating. After a moment he spoke, his voice rough and raspy, a sound of dry earth and strained effort. "Nahuel," he croaked, introducing himself. Jed nodded, acknowledging the name, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "Jed," he responded, his own name a guttural sound that seemed to carry the weight of his solitary existence, his years of quiet endurance. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the unspoken questions, the cautious hope, and the nascent understanding between two men from vastly different worlds, now bound together by a single, desperate act of kindness. The next day, Nahuel was still weak, but his fever had broken. He sat propped against a stack of hay bales, watching Jed go about his chores. There was a cautious curiosity in his gaze, a silent request for understanding. Jed, though still guarded, found himself answering unspoken questions with gestures and simple words. He explained the workings of the ranch, the need for water, the endless struggle against the unforgiving land. Nahuel, in turn, shared glimpses of his own life, not with words, but with the way he handled a piece of leather, the way his eyes tracked a hawk circling overhead, the quiet dignity in his movements despite his weakness. Jed found himself talking more than he had in years, recounting the loneliness, the battles, the sense of being lost after the war. He spoke of the land, how it demanded everything and gave little in return. Nahuel listened, his dark eyes reflecting an understanding that transcended language. He pointed to Jed's weathered hands, then to his own wound, a gesture that spoke of shared hardship. Jed felt a strange sense of relief, as if a dam within him had cracked, letting out a trickle of suppressed emotion. But the fragile peace was constantly threatened by the shadows of Jed's past. He remembered the raids, the screams, the burning homesteads. He'd seen friends, neighbors fall to Apache arrows. The ingrained fear was a constant tremor beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. He found himself periodically glancing out the barn door, scanning the horizon, a habit born of years living on the edge. He knew that for every act of kindness there was a debt that often had to be paid in blood in this unforgiving land. The thought gnawed at him. What would Nahuel's people think? Would they see his act as mercy, or as something else entirely? The silence between them, once comforting, now felt heavy with unspoken apprehension. Jed woke before dawn, the chill of the morning seeping through the thin walls of his cabin. He dressed quickly, his movements automatic, and headed for the barn. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in faint pastels of pink and orange. As he reached the barn door, he noticed something. The air was different, still, too still. The usual sounds of the awakening prairie, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of dry leaves, were absent. A prickle of unease ran down his spine. He pushed the heavy barn door open, and the sight that met him stole his breath. There, spread across the dusty plains surrounding his ranch, were 50 Apache warriors. Mounted on their horses, silent and imposing, they formed a grim semicircle, their gazes fixed on his barn. Their faces, painted and stoic, revealed nothing. The rising sun cast long, ominous shadows, making them appear even more formidable. The air thrummed with an unspoken tension, a silent challenge. Jed felt a cold dread settle in his gut. This was it, the reckoning he had feared. In the center of the silent formation, mounted on a powerful bay horse, was a tall, imposing figure. His headdress, adorned with eagle feathers, marked him as a leader. Chaitin. Jed recognized the name from whispers and warnings. A respected chief, fierce and protective of his people. He was Nahuel's father. Jed's eyes darted to Nahuel, who was now standing shakily just inside the barn, his face a mixture of fear and a dawning understanding. He looked from his father to Jed, a silent plea in his eyes. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and entirely alone. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken threats. He could feel the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on him, each one a question, a judgment. The last meal he shared with Nahuel, an act of simple compassion, had, it seemed, brought an army to his doorstep. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The fight for his life, or perhaps for something far more significant, had just begun. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're hooked by this story. The tension is only going to build from here. The morning sun began its ascent, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the scene. Jed stood at the barn entrance, his silhouette stark against the dim interior. He felt exposed, vulnerable. His hand remained at his side, a deliberate choice. Any sudden movement, any reach for his rifle, could be misinterpreted, could ignite the tinderbox of tension that hung in the air. The Apache warriors remained motionless, their stoic expressions revealing nothing of their intentions. Their silence was more unnerving than any war cry. Chaitin, the chief, slowly dismounted, his movements deliberate and powerful. He walked a few paces forward, his eyes never leaving Jed. The other warriors remained mounted, their horses occasionally snorting, the only sounds breaking the absolute stillness. Jed could feel the sweat trickling down his back, despite the cool morning air. He tried to read Chaitan's face, searching for a sign of anger, of curiosity, of anything. But the chief's expression was a mask of stone. Inside the barn, Nahuel swayed slightly, his hand pressed against his bandaged side. He wanted to speak, to explain, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. He looked from his father to Jed, a silent appeal in his eyes. He knew the volatile nature of the situation. His tribe's history with the settlers was etched in blood, and a white man helping an Apache was almost unheard of, often viewed with deep suspicion. He worried for Jed, but also for his own family, understanding the rigid traditions and expectations that governed their actions. Jed took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of his heart. He knew he had to speak, to show he meant no harm. But what words could bridge such a vast chasm of mistrust? The weight of centuries of conflict, of broken promises and violent encounters pressed down on him. He was just one man against 50, but he had to try. He had to convey that his act of kindness was just that and not a deception. Jed raised his hands slowly, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," he said, his voice raspy from disuse but firm. "Your son, he was wounded. I helped him." He pointed to Nahuel, who had now stepped a little further into view, his presence a living testament to Jed's words. Chaitan's eyes flickered to Nahuel, a momentary softening in their intensity. Chaitan raised a hand, his voice deep and resonant. He spoke in Apache, a string of guttural sounds that Jed couldn't understand, but the tone was commanding. Nahuel, despite his weakness, took a few steps forward. "He saved my life, father," Nahuel said, his voice weak but clear in the still morning air, translating for Jed. "He gave me water, food. He bound my wound." A murmur went through the Apache warriors, a mix of surprise and skepticism. Chaitan's gaze returned to Jed, a new intensity in his eyes. He walked closer, stopping just a few feet from Jed, observing him intently. Jed met his gaze, refusing to flinch, refusing to show fear. He knew this was a test, a moment of profound judgment. He had to rely on the simple truth of his actions rather than elaborate words. He gestured to the sparse interior of his barn, the modest supplies, the signs of a solitary life. He pointed to the empty plate where he had shared his last meal with Nahuel, a silent testament to his generosity. He explained simply that he saw a man in need, regardless of his tribe or color. He spoke of the common bond of suffering, of being alone in a harsh land. Ilara, a wise and observant curandera, healer of the tribe, quietly dismounted from her horse and walked closer, her gaze thoughtful as she examined Nahuel's wound and Jed's makeshift bandage. Her silent assessment seemed to hold weight with Chaitan, whose expression began to shift, a hint of something other than suspicion entering his eyes. The sun climbed higher, warming the cool morning air. Chaitan listened intently to Nahuel's words, his eyes moving between his son and Jed. Ilara, having examined Nahuel's wound, nodded subtly to Chaitan, her expression confirming the care Jed had provided. This quiet affirmation seemed to chip away at the chief's initial suspicion. He turned back to Jed, a new question in his eyes, unspoken but clear. Why? Why would a white man, notorious for their animosity towards the Apache, risk so much for one of their own? Jed, sensing the shift, spoke again, his voice lower, more personal. He spoke of his own losses, the way the war had stripped him bare, leaving him with little but the dust beneath his feet. He spoke of the shared struggle for survival in this desolate land, a struggle that transcended tribal lines. He didn't ask for gratitude. He simply laid bare his own humanity, flawed and scarred, but present. He explained that he saw not an enemy, but a fellow man in dire need, and that was enough. Nahuel, standing beside Jed, reinforced his father's questions, relaying Jed's sincerity. He spoke of Jed's quiet diligence, his lack of fear even in the face of his illness, and the simple kindness of sharing what little he had. He described the moment Jed had found him, the struggle to get him back to the barn, and the painstaking care he had taken with the wound. The truth, raw and unadorned, began to resonate with Chaitin. A long silence followed, broken only by the gentle rustle of the wind. The 50 warriors remained still, observing, listening. The tension, though still present, had lessened, replaced by a profound curiosity. Chaitin's face remained unreadable for a moment longer. Then he finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. He spoke in Apache, his words a stream of sounds Jed couldn't comprehend, but he recognized the change in tone. Nahuel translated, his voice filled with relief. "My father says he sees your truth. He thanks you for saving his son. This is a pivotal moment in our story. If you're captivated by the unexpected turn of events, remember to subscribe. There's so much more to come." The relief that washed over Jed was immense, a wave that threatened to buckle his knees. The silent, menacing circle of warriors had transformed, subtly but profoundly. Chaitin's words, relayed by Nahuel, had broken the spell of impending conflict. The chief, still unsmiling, gestured to his warriors. They began to dismount, their movements less rigid though still cautious. Some led their horses to the trough, while others began to set up a temporary camp around the perimeter of Jed's ranch, a silent declaration of their presence, but now without the immediate threat of violence. Ilara approached Jed, her eyes wise and knowing. She carried a small leather pouch from which she extracted a handful of dried herbs. She knelt beside Nahuel, redressing his wound with a practiced hand, applying a poultice made from the herbs. Her touch was gentle, her demeanor calm. Jed watched, a respectful distance away, acknowledging her skill. She glanced at him, a fleeting, almost imperceptible nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement of his own efforts. For the rest of the day, an uneasy truce settled over the ranch. The air was still thick with unspoken questions and lingering suspicion, but the immediate threat of bloodshed had receded. Apache warriors moved with quiet efficiency, tending to their horses, preparing a communal meal. Jed, still wary, went about his own chores, constantly aware of their presence. He kept his rifle visible, but never lifted it in a threatening manner. It was a silent negotiation of boundaries, a slow dance of trust. Nahuel, though still recovering, acted as a crucial bridge. He translated casual exchanges, explaining customs, clarifying intentions. He spoke of his gratitude to Jed, acknowledging the risk Jed had taken. Jed, in turn, began to see the Apaches not just as a faceless threat, but as individuals. A warrior with a scarred face, a young man who tended to the horses with care, a woman who watched him with an unsettling intensity. The seeds of understanding, however small, were being sown in the dusty soil of the ranch. Days turned into a week. The Apache encampment remained, a constant, vivid presence around Jed's ranch. The initial tension slowly dissipated, replaced by a strange, almost symbiotic coexistence. Jed, though still private, found himself interacting more with the warriors. He offered them water from his well, and in return, they shared their freshly hunted game, the aroma of roasting meat filling the evening air. Barriers slowly eroded, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of mutual respect and necessity. Jed learned about the Apaches' deep connection to the land, their intricate knowledge of its secrets, their traditions and beliefs. He saw their discipline, their resilience, their unwavering loyalty to their tribe. He watched Chaitin, a leader of quiet strength and unwavering dedication to his people. He found a shared understanding in their mutual respect for the harsh realities of the prairie and the sheer will to survive. He began to see the truth behind the myths, the humanity beneath the formidable exterior. Nahuel, now largely recovered, spent hours talking with Jed, sharing stories of his life, his training, his hopes for his tribe. Jed, in turn, spoke of his own experiences, his struggles, his longing for a life that was constantly just out of reach. They found common ground in their shared solitude, their resilience, and their quiet determination. Nahuel helped Jed with chores, learning about the intricacies of ranching, while Jed learned rudimentary Apache words and phrases. Their bond deepened, forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability and unexpected kindness. Yet even in this fragile peace, Jed knew it was temporary. The world outside their small ranch was still a place of conflict, of misunderstanding, of violence. But for now, here, on his small patch of land, a unique and unprecedented alliance had formed. He had faced his fears, opened his home, and found not an enemy, but a connection that transcended the lines drawn by society and history. The day came when the Apache camp began to stir with an unspoken energy. The horses were restless, the warriors packing their belongings with a quiet efficiency. Chayton approached Jed, his gaze steady, his face still unreadable. Nahuel stood beside his father, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and solemnity. "My people must move on," Chayton stated, his voice calm, translated by Nahuel. "The spirits guide us elsewhere." He paused, then extended a hand towards Jed, a gesture of respect that transcended the cultural divide. "You are a man of honor, Jed Stone. You showed kindness where others would have shown hate. This debt is remembered." Jed took Chayton's hand, a firm grip that spoke volumes. "May your path be clear, Chief," Jed replied, his voice gruff but sincere. He looked at Nahuel. "Take care, son." Nahuel nodded, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. As the sun rose, painting the sky with fiery streaks, the 50 Apache warriors mounted their horses. They moved as one, a silent, powerful force. Chayton and Nahuel were among the last. Chayton turned, offering Jed one last, long look, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. Then, with a gentle nudge of his heels, he led his people away, disappearing over the horizon, leaving only dust and the memory of their presence. Jed stood alone in front of his barn, the silence of the prairie once again his sole companion. The air felt lighter, yet somehow heavier too. He was still a loner rancher, his life still one of solitude and hard work. But something had changed within him. The walls he had built around his heart had crumbled, allowing in a sliver of connection, a reminder of the inherent good that could exist even in the harshest of worlds. He had faced his deepest fears and found not a destructive fire, but a glimmer of understanding. The shared meal, the wounded Apache, and the 50 warriors surrounding his barn, it had all been a crucible, forging a new path for Jed Stone, a path where compassion, however unexpected, could truly change everything. His world might be vast and unforgiving, but now he carried with him the quiet knowledge that humanity, in its most unexpected forms, could still be found even in the most desolate places. And that concludes our story. Loner rancher shared last meal with wounded Apache. The next morning, 50 warriors surrounded his barn. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of the Old West and the unexpected connections forged between people, please like this video, share it with your friends, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories. Your support helps us bring more narratives like this to life.